We have never seen an economic shock of this speed, magnitude and shape.
We didn't expect it to hit that fast.
Australians came into this crisis totally unprepared.
It's just been a massive hit.
The downturn in economic activity.
We're going to see higher unemployment.
My job no longer exists.
Some of the highest rates of household debt in the world.
A lot of my friends lost jobs.
A recession is unfolding.
Worst decline since the global financial crisis.
Greater than the global financial crisis.
We are heading for a deep global recession.
It's on track to be the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression. In the short term alone, more than $300 billion wiped off the share market. House prices set to fall up to 20%, unemployment to double to 10%, a predicted 6.7% hit to GDP and 10% fall in national output.
These are all very large numbers and ones that were inconceivable just a month or two ago.
To cope, we're set to rack up $1.5 trillion in public debt by next year, the highest since our post-World War II years.
We're headed for a generation of debt, unfortunately.
And all that's just the tip of the iceberg. The reality is we don't yet know where rock bottom is.
It's difficult to call the bottom of this thing because it's happened so fast. We're going from a situation of 28 years of uninterrupted growth to suddenly a very deep recession. And it may be 12 to 18 months before we return to something that approximates a new normal.
2/3 of Aussie businesses have taken a hit. Retail, hospitality, tourism, the arts, higher education among the worst affected. Some will bounce back. Others, if they survive, will never be the same. And perhaps the biggest obstacle to economic recovery is the very thing that's protected us throughout the health part of this crisis, our closed borders.
Migration has been a key driver of Australia's economic growth. It's driven housing demand, demand for goods and services and demand for infrastructure as well.
More than half of Australia's population growth from 2005 has come from overseas migration. Now we face months, or more likely years, of stagnation.
You're going to get large parts of Australia suffering population decline, and in that world, it's hard to see the economy recovering.
The government says the economy is simply in
hibernation.
And when we awake, we'll
snap back.
But it might not be that simple.
When a government talks about a snapback, it knows from its own history that it didn't happen in the previous two recessions.
So if we don't snap back, what does our pathway out of this look like? The government's position seems to be to unleash the private sector with low tax and deregulation. But history tells us it's only when governments keep spending that things truly turn around. Australia's
stimulus package
during the GFC, all $52 billion worth, saw us become one of only 3 developed nations to avoid a recession. For countries who didn't intervene, it was a very different story.
To Greece, a country on the brink of collapse.
Australia's experience in the global financial crisis was different from the experience of many other countries. And the principal reason for that is that the Australian government at the time acted early. It was delivering support to households before the crisis actually hit.
But the better comparison may be the Great Depression, because if this crisis goes on long enough, we may end up in a situation where businesses are open, but no one's got any money to buy anything. Back then, governments tried lots of things we might be tempted to try as well. Some tried to isolate themselves from the world economy by increasing tariffs or limiting imports. Generally, those countries made the depression deeper and longer. So that push, some are suggesting, towards a less globalised economy might not be as good an idea as it sounds.
Australia has been a great beneficiary of globalisation and of global free trade, so that ought to be what we're looking to try and continue.
We should be careful not to retreat from globalisation.
Other countries responded to the Depression with big government spending programs, which most economists agree helped. The most famous is Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which launched with a parade. This was a massive government program, and it built a new society. Huge public works, farm subsidies, reopening international trade, a new minimum wage, and the creation of a whole social security system.
In the present spirit of mutual encouragement, we go forward.
So what might today's version of that look like?
Today's version of the New Deal would be massive public works programs.
The government needs to think long and hard about what it does in the construction space.
And particularly to keep the tradespeople fully employed.
Tax reform ought to be the first thing. We think that there ought to be a focus on infrastructure investment and, in particular, climate and energy policy should play a role in this story as well.
But where will the money come from? Well, that depends on how much you care about having a budget deficit. In the past, the government has cared very much.
The budget is back in the black.
The budget in surplus.
Australia is back on track.
Budget back to surplus.
I would say that among the things that we have to worry about right now, the budget deficit and the associated public debt is toward the bottom of the list. Maybe it's the last thing we should be worried about right now.
Governments all come to these moments carrying their political ideals, but crises like this one have a habit of taking them places they never thought they'd go. Government spending's bad until it isn't. Surpluses are really important until they aren't.
It's not our primary focus.
Lots will depend on just how deep the economic hole gets, but it's a fair bet our recovery will end up being government-led in some way.
The task for us right now is to fashion a country that can make the best of the world that we live in, whatever the shape of that world.
Right now is a chance for our politicians to focus on the next century, not just the next election cycle. Australia could be dealing with the fallout from this crisis for decades to come. That's what we saw after the Great Depression. But that period also saw the creation of some of our greatest national treasures. The Great Ocean Road, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, both built in the 30s by workers desperately in need of a job. Both projects helping keep local economies afloat. The Australia forged back then by our government and our people is the Australia we treasure now. And the nation we build in these extraordinary times will define this country for generations to come.
So government projects, we may end up with a bigger banana or a bigger pineapple.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, why stop there? There've got to be other fruits.
There'll be other fruits. When you hear an economist say, like, the economy and the budget being in service is at the lower end of what we should be thinking about right now. It's quite stark,
It puts everything that we've assumed about the economy in perspective. It's a totally different world we're going to inherit. One of the things that happened in the Depression was fascinating was Roosevelt actually came up with two budgets. So he had one budget was a non-emergency normal budget, and that was in balance.
Wow.
And then he had an emergency budget, which was for fighting the Depression, and that had a deficit. So he could still sort of say, we're not being completely reckless, but we're spending for a very particular reason, and maybe we'll end up doing something like that.
Pretty sure my wife runs another budget behind my back, to be honest.
That's a big FDR fan. She always has been.